This program is brought to you by the Forbes-featured Freedom Hub Health Plan, the alternative to overpriced and restrictive insurance. The Freedom Hub Health Plan is exactly what you need. By Frequency Medicine Associates, supporting health professionals and laypersons with safe and effective advanced telemedicine-like technology that can scan and help rebalance the root causes of stress and illness. By the Planet Lockdown film, which can be seen on the Freedom Hub's Rumble channel along with many great speakers. And by The Pavilion, a 21st century community hub that brings together many of the disruptive innovations featured by the Freedom Hub, including direct pay healthcare, farm-to-table dining, TED-like Freedom Hub talks, and more. Visit your-mp.com/pavilion solution for details.
Welcome, folks, to Freedom Hub's weekly webinar. I'm Charlie Froman, back from vacation. Jim, thanks for keeping the enterprise alive in my absence. He's always here as the co-host, documentarian. Did you have a pearl of wisdom, Jim, to share now or after I sort of set the stage?
Thanks, Charlie. No, let's just move on today.
Okay. Here's our website, your-mp.com. Every week you'll see our coming guest on the Wednesday Health Show and this Liberty Show. And let's keep in mind our sponsor, the Forbes featured sharing combo with health savings accounts. Cut your costs in half, no network, so good times. This is a really a good privilege for me. I've followed Tom Woods ever since the crash days of the mid-2000s. In the mid-90s, Ron Paul almost hired me to run his Liberty Caucus. And it was back then when I was a lobbyist, I would go to his congressional office, and it was such a haven amid this squalor, this pig trough of DC. And I was becoming a libertarian then, and the usual routes, Milton Friedman to Hayek to Rothbard. And then during the crash of 2007, when really everyone kind of got educated on the Feds, Tom Woods wrote Meltdown, which was a fantastic book. We learned his Harvard education came into good use. He really was a good communicator. It's a fantastic book. He had a controversial book, Politically Incorrect Guide to American History, which I loved. And it kind of uses that Rothbardian liberty versus power filter to look at history, which, makes it kind of easy to enjoy history more. You see, what was a special interest scheme involved here or there? Hopefully we'll get into that. I want to mention also my non-libertarian wife. I caught her reading one day how the Catholic Church built Western civilization, Tom. And I was hoping that it would, by osmosis, make her more libertarian. It hasn't worked, but she's a good Catholic. And it seemed to me at the end, maybe that's the book that we could use to plant into the mainstream and, indirectly make them libertarian. Hopefully we'll touch on that book. That's always an interesting topic. The Middle Ages, how did natural law develop? He has a curriculum for homeschoolers, the Ron Paul curriculum. His daily podcast is listened to by thousands, probably more. It educates people so well because he's a great communicator. That's one of the things we want to get out of today is, the importance of communicating, knowing your audience. He has a new venture on the parallel economy, how all of us, dreamers and activists can make money doing good. That hails to me to the conscious capitalism effort of John Mackey at Whole Foods, which I was involved with. But today, we're going to build kind of on a previous guest, that Cal Exit guy who was trying in a funny way to get Texans to help him get California out of the union. And National Divorce, his new book, is important because the mass formation that we now think we're all surrounded with from this COVID hysteria makes some of us think that we can't stay in the same union with these people that so easily will hurt us or try to mandate us or whatever. The Trump trigger that so many face is in play here. It gets to the classic political economic phrase of word of federalism, the tug of war between the national government and the 50 states. How do we best structure government to preserve our rights? And with that, Tom, take it away. Anything I've said, your new book, where we're at, we're free for all here.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I am unexpectedly out of town. I'm in Los Angeles, so I'm sitting in a hotel ballroom, with crazy hotel noises around me, and with my fingers crossed that nobody's going to be using this ballroom in the next hour. But it's a big building. I'm only one guy. I can always carve someplace out. So thank you, Charles, for welcoming me. I actually own the domain nationaldivorce.com. It is not in use yet. It'll be in use by tomorrow. That's where my new ebook will reside. Nationaldivorce.com cost me $4,000, but it'll be worth it because, wow, how do you own nationaldivorce.com? It gives you instant credibility on the subject, and it will do some good if you're promoting something to a big audience. You won't even notice that expense. But for the time being, I have a different link for the book until that transfer is complete, but we'll talk about that later. I do have an ebook called National Divorce, the peaceful solution to irreconcilable differences, and I give it away for nothing. So the question of how are you going to make a living after you just spent $4K on the domain giving away an ebook, that's a separate seminar, and I'd be very glad to run that one and explain how you can prosper in a world of free. But that's not our topic today. Topic today is national divorce. So I'm happy to entertain these sorts of questions in the Q&A, but I'm not going to start with the why do we need national divorce, because that, I think either you see that or you don't. I mean, either you see that we have different ideological groups at each other's throats, and I think there's one more inclined than the other to feel like it has to shove its ideas down the throats of the other. I think it's obvious enough that it would be better for us to leave each other alone. And if we did, maybe in our own localities, we could build the kind of societies that would make each of us happy. Now, there are problems, of course, with this. It's not a neat solution. There are more than two ideologies in the country. I certainly don't belong to the two reigning ones. Official conservatism and official liberalism are both foreign to me. So it doesn't solve all problems. And then you would have some practical issues to work out, like what about the repayment of the national debt? And these are topics that it's not like nobody's ever covered them before. A number of countries have gone through this exact process, and sometimes they apportion the national debt according to population or according to GDP, but they figure something out. I mean, these obviously might be a tricky problem, but it can't be a completely intractable one. But instead, I want to spend my opening time framing the issue a bit in a way that I think will help people think about it more clearly, especially because in American history, let's just say the idea of some kind of separation or secession is, of course, demonized. That's the one thing that's not allowed. The New York Times won't allow you to consider that. CNN won't allow you to consider that. Respectable opinion won't allow you to consider it. And anytime there's a way of looking at the world that the establishment won't allow me to consider, I'm curious about it. Doesn't mean they're all correct. Some of them are mutually exclusive, but I'm curious. What is it about this that makes it toxic to the Mitt Romneys and Liz Cheneys and Hillary Clintons and Henry Kissingers of the world? What is it? Why are they disproportionately upset about this and only mildly upset that the Iraq war turned out to be a fiasco and countless people died for no good reason? That's a mistake and it's regrettable, but this is absolutely forbidden. And that should make you wonder, why would this, which is just a practical question, how big should the country be? Where should the borders be drawn? That's just a practical question, right? No reason to be fanatics about this. We're not dealing with sacraments of a religion. We're dealing with a practical arrangement, and yet it makes them crazy. Thomas Jefferson did look at the United States as a practical arrangement, at the Union as a practical arrangement. Either it's going to work to advance liberty or it's not. And we'll just wait and see. And if it doesn't, we'll try something else. But ever since the so-called Civil War, I think people think that the Union is an end in itself. It's an end in itself, but liberty is the end in itself. The Union is only a means to that end, and if it's not working, then you try something else. I mean, again, that's the way. If this were anything other than the American Union, we would all be capable of thinking freely about it. But and because it just set that aside, set your emotional attachment to the Union aside for a minute, and imagine that you're a guy in the middle of Zimbabwe hearing this. You would think, well, that sounds practical enough. But yet, in the United States, it's like I'm violating some sacred code or something. And that's a bad place to be in. If you can't consider obviously legitimate alternatives because of a basically religious commitment, that's a problem. Then we can't talk to each other. So what I want to do is spend most of my time talking to you about two people. And these two people help you to understand two very different ways of organizing our lives together. Now, if I had a third one, I would give you an ANCAP who's going to give you a radically different way to organize our lives together, but I'm not going to do that. I want to give you two people who will actually, even though neither of them was an American, and both of them lived before the United States was even a political unit, these are people, though, who in some ways can explain to Americans what their country is all about better than most Americans can. And the two people I have in mind are, there's one you've heard of and one you may not have. The one you may not have heard of is Johannes Althusius, who was a theorist of the Dutch Federation, wrote a work called Politica in the early 17th century. And the other one is Thomas Hobbes, who wrote, mid-17th century, wrote the book Leviathan. And that's the one you're more likely to have heard of. So let's start with Althusius, because when we start with Althusius, we hear described for us a model that is quite different from the one that we have lived under in most of the Western world for the past couple of hundred years. By the way, if that background noise is getting to be too loud, somebody jump in and tell me, and I'll see if I can find a quiet haven around here, but
It's okay.
okay, good. All right. So Johannes Althusius basically says the following. According to Althusius, society is not composed of a bunch of isolated, atomized individuals. Society is not just an undifferentiated blob of individual people. Society is not just a flat plane. We might think of it instead as a series of levels, that it's a series of little societies whose symbiotic relation gives us our society at large. So for instance, for Althusius, we begin first and foremost with the household. The household, or the family, is the fundamental political unit for Althusius. A group of households can come together and create a village. A group of villages can come together and create a province, and so on. So you notice that the end result of what you have is not just a blob, it's a bunch of provinces, which each in turn consist of a bunch of villages, which each in turn consist of a bunch of households. So it's a series of little societies, a series of levels. And so when we look through the High Middle Ages, this is precisely what we see. We have various institutions operating independently of each other, and each one has rights and liberties of its own that can't just be arbitrarily modified or canceled by any other body. So in the High Middle Ages, the universities had their own powers and rights. Guilds had powers and rights. Cities had powers and rights. The church had powers and rights. Each of these institutions had pre-existing liberties, and no one of them could just bark out irresistible commands at the others. Now, it's worth noting there's a great Liberty Fund, some of you may be familiar with. Liberty Fund for many years has published inexpensive editions of classic works in our tradition. And they published a couple of books by a historian named Bertrand de Jouvenel. And Bertrand de Jouvenel, one of his books, pointed out why it is that the full titles of some of the kings in European history seem preposterously long. So if any of you who've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, we hear at one point the full title of the legendary King Arthur. He is the king of the Britons, and he's the this of the this, and the protector of that, and the defender of so-and-so. And de Jouvenel's point is that these long titles are not a sign of vanity on the king's part. This long title that a king might have means that he's part of a web of relationships, that there's a series of peoples and institutions beneath him whose powers and liberties he can't just abolish. So he's the protector of those liberties. He can't just arbitrarily bark commands out at them through a bullhorn. So the king is hemmed in on all sides by various competing power centers, and he had to deal with that. And if one of these power centers resists the king, this is not treason, quote unquote. This is a blow for liberty. So for example, by today's standards, if we look at a medieval city, the medieval cities were oases of freedom in the midst of a feudal society. How did the medieval cities win their liberties? By resisting the king. So suppose the king needs help during a military conflict against another power. He might appeal to the cities for help, and they'd help him all right, but in exchange for being granted various liberties when the conflict is over. So nobody at that time would say, these cities are guilty of treason. That was just the way society worked. Yeah, we'll help you all right, but you're gonna have to do something for us. It was a give and take between different levels. It wasn't a flat plane with one irresistible power center barking out orders at this undifferentiated flat plane. Now, on the other hand, we have the system of Thomas Hobbes. And in Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes will have none of what we just said. Society for him is a flat plane. It is a bunch of isolated individuals who have no other social identities that the political power needs to make reference to. At the center of this society that Hobbes envisions is a single infallible power center. So any subsidiary bodies beneath this power center, cities, families, the church, whatever, has only the liberties that the central authority chooses to acknowledge. And those liberties can be modified or canceled at any time because there's only one power center. So the contrast with Althusius is pretty obvious. I mean, remember, according to Althusius, the liberties of the various bodies outside the center preceded the central authority. And it was the job of the central authority, at least in principle, to protect and defend those pre-existing liberties. In the Hobbesian system, there are no rights or liberties that do not flow from the will of the central power. And that central power can modify or abolish them at any time. So under the Hobbesian system, with its single, irresistible, infallible, indestructible power center, if one of these subsidiary bodies resists the center, it's no longer a virtue to be celebrated. Why? It's treason. Ooh, they rose up against their overlord. We can't have that. So they gave it a scary sounding name, treason, that every dope in the world instantly adopted in order to demonize resistors. So when today you hear people disparage the very idea of secession, which simply means that a political unit has become unwieldy and it's not serving the people over whom it rules, so they're going to try a different arrangement. That's all it is. There's no reason to demonize it. But when you hear people doing that, or when you hear people demonizing the idea of state nullification, another Thomas Jefferson idea, that in order for the states not to be swallowed up by the central authority that they themselves created, they need to have the power to refuse to enforce or obstruct the enforcement of unconstitutional laws within their borders. You hear people calling this treason and evil and all that. Well, they don't know any better. They've uncritically absorbed these Hobbesian assumptions that we're all taught in school. And so because of those preconceptions, it's metaphysically impossible for them to look at any of these subsidiary bodies and think it could have a life of its own, or to think that these bodies could exercise a power that the central authority has not authorized. They can't conceive of this. It's like you're asking them to describe a square circle. It can't be conceived of. They can't make sense of it. So all they can do is shout treason. Well, since the French Revolution, the Hobbesian model has pretty much won the day throughout most of the Western world. And yet the assumptions behind it remain unexamined in the minds of most people. In fact, they're so ingrained, people don't even notice that they're there. So there are 2 points we want to make now, going from learning about these 2 people. First of all, I want to thank somebody, retired professor from Emory University, Donald Livingston, is the person who first introduced me to Althusius, and I had no idea how fruitful it would be to come into contact with this particular historical figure. So there are two things I want to say. Well, number one is how has this arrangement worked out, whereby we have one irresistible power center and that's it. And the second thing is, how does this relate to American history? And I think it'll become pretty obvious in a minute what this has to do with American history, if it isn't already. So, by the way, as I was leaving the front desk area of the hotel, you know, they have the little store with the little bit of food and drink. The only thing that was even remotely drinkable was this Minute Maid lemonade. The rest of it is all the weirdest Los Angeles bizarro kind of drinks in the world. So yes, I know it's full of toxic stuff, but it's the only thing I can tolerate. All right, so the 20th century should be obvious enough. The totalitarian revolutions of the 20th century were horrors of almost incalculable magnitude. Wars were fought on a scale and with a destructive capacity that just boggled the mind. On a lesser scale, we have impossible levels of debt and bureaucracy. We are ruled by self-perpetuating fiefdoms that seem impossible to even to reform, much less dismantle. The modern state, with its inspiration from Hobbes, has been at war with human flourishing. And yet the question of the proper size of the political unit and whether the best way for human beings to live is in these gigantic centralized states is just never raised. And since everyone just takes Hobbes's assumptions for granted, it never occurs to them even to consider alternatives. Now, it's true John Locke comes after Hobbes, and it's likewise true that John Locke had some criticisms of Hobbes, but even Locke is still thinking in terms of an irresistible power center, as are the overwhelming majority of modern political thinkers. They all think in terms of that indivisible Hobbesian state. So the entirely reasonable question of whether it should be possible for smaller units to withdraw from a larger one and determine their own destinies is just never raised. So I might add, by the way, that there is a school of historians who argue that it's precisely because Western civilization did not develop a continent-wide empire after the fall of Rome, that we developed the tradition of liberty and capitalism, because in place of a continent-wide empire was a large number of small political units. And because of their small size and the relative ease of exit, each one risked losing its tax base if it became too oppressive. So unfortunately, we don't have really that advantage today because political units have grown larger and the possibility of exit is more remote and less convenient. The pressure on these regimes exerted by people voting with their feet has diminished. Now, let me proceed to the American case and see how we apply Althusius versus Hobbes to our example. Now, I could give a presentation on the legitimacy of the secession of an American state from the Union without even mentioning Althusius or Hobbes. I could talk about the 10th Amendment. I could argue about several states, including rescission clauses when they join the Union. I could do all that. But to me, the best, most systematic, and most convincing, and therefore completely unknown arguments involve these two thinkers. And so there are two theories about the American Union. And when I describe them to you, I think you will instantly see which one fits in with the Althusian model and which one with the Hobbesian. So one of them is called the nationalist theory, and it's put forth by people like Daniel Webster and Joseph Story, and at least implicitly, though not systematically, by Alexander Hamilton. The other one is the compact theory, articulated by Thomas Jefferson, as well as lesser-known figures like St. George Tucker and Abel Upshur. The nationalist theory holds that the United States is a single, indivisible whole with a single, indivisible power center. The states are just administrative units of the center and have no independent existences of their own. Well, that, obviously enough, is the Hobbesian model. And that's why people who believe in this perspective can't even conceive of a legitimate secession. This is metaphysically impossible. To them, the United States is not a grouping together of disparate societies for practical utilitarian purposes. It's a single, indivisible block. And so secession is inconceivable to someone who thinks like this. So instead of looking at the situation accurately, that is to say, instead of looking at it like this sovereign body has chosen to withdraw from a confederation of states that it used its sovereignty to join in the first place, they think instead, this arbitrary grouping of individuals over here is disobeying the central authority. That's the way they look at it. Now, if you have absorbed these Hobbesian preconceptions that have been drilled into us, you're going to gravitate toward this nationalist theory, and you're going to seek out evidence to try to support it because you can't think of any other way to arrange society. By contrast, if by some miracle you manage to be introduced to the Althusian model that we've been describing here, you'll be attracted to the compact theory, which holds that the United States is a collection of societies and not an undifferentiated blob. The states preceded the Union and have separate liberties and existences of their own. And this is exactly analogous to the model of Althusius. And as it happens, the founding fathers were quite fond of the Dutch Federation, about which Althusius wrote. Now, the evidence is entirely in support of the compact theory, entirely. This is why my friend, historian Brian McClanahan, refuses to call it the compact theory. He calls it the compact fact. So, for instance, consider the Declaration of Independence. It does not refer to the independence of a single blob. It speaks of free and independent states in the plural. And let's make sure we understand what they mean by states. As Americans, we hear states and we think Virginia, Pennsylvania, Georgia, whatever. But of course, that's not what they mean in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is speaking of states in the standard dictionary definition, which means states like France and Spain. That's what the document has in mind when it speaks of free and independent states that have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. That's what they're talking about. Then we have the Treaty of Paris, which brought the American War for Independence to an end. Now look at that. In that treaty, the British are not acknowledging the independence of a single blob called the United States of America. They recognize the independence of a collection of states, which they then proceed to name one by one. But this also holds in various other treaties that were entered into during the war with other European countries. The reference is always to individual states, never to some single whole called the United States. Already during the War for Independence, we see the colonies/states are engaged in activities that we associate with sovereignty. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina outfitted ships to cruise against the British. Ticonderoga was taken by the troops of Connecticut. In New Hampshire, the executive was authorized to issue letters of marque and reprisal. And in 1776, it was declared that the crime of treason would be thought of not as being perpetrated against the states united into an indivisible blob, but against the states individually. Then we have the Articles of Confederation, which has the extremely significant Article 2. Article 2 tells us that the states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Well, you obviously can't retain something unless you had it in the first place. So the states must have possessed sovereignty before, if they're retaining it, in 1781. So the point is, you look at American history, it's all Althusian. It's all about smaller units having independent existences and acting as if they have independent existences and acting as if they have liberties and the powers to do various things. American history is an Althusian history. And that holds true when we look at how the Constitution was ratified. If this were a Hobbesian regime of a single undifferentiated mass, we would have had one national vote up or down on the Constitution, but we did not. What did we have? Individual ratifications of the states involved, assembled in convention. In the Constitution itself, you will not find one case in which the United States is referred to in the singular. It's always referred to as the United States are. Why? Because we're an Althusian federation. We're a collection of societies. We're not a single Hobbesian blob. And I might add very quickly that one of the well-known international lawyers of the 18th century, Emmerich de Vattel, wrote a book called The Law of Nations in 1758. And he said that a sovereign body can join a confederation without forfeiting its sovereignty. So the mere fact that the states ratify the Constitution doesn't mean, well, now they're not sovereign anymore. Now the peoples of the states aren't sovereign anymore. No, they're exercising their sovereignty to choose to join this confederation. And they still have the sovereignty because you can't alienate sovereignty. And so they could just as easily and just as logically exercise that sovereignty to withdraw. So the compact theory follows directly from the facts of American history, from the norms of international law, and has the added benefit of conforming to this morally attractive model of Althusius. Now, there are other things we could say if all I wanted to do was to defend constitutionally or legally or morally or strategically the right of a state or a group of states to chart their own destiny, but I don't need to do that. What I wanted to do this morning was simply to introduce these two models to you that derived from the minds of these two individuals and show how they apply to American history. And I venture to suggest that there is not a classroom in America that teaches any of what I just said, and yet it's all staring us all in the face. Everything I just said, I was just citing, I wasn't exactly citing obscure documents I had to dig up in some library somewhere. I mean, I'm referring to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation. This is all sitting there right in front of us. But because to teach it this way doesn't conform to the reigning narrative, it doesn't get taught this way. So I'm happy to proceed now with any questions folks may have. I will say that until I have nationaldivorce.com set up, I do have that ebook available at tomwoods.com/nationaldivorce. So if that interests you, you want to read a little bit more, and I actually do discuss a little bit of this material that I just shared today in that ebook also. You can get it at tomwoods.com/nationaldivorce.
Thanks, Tom. Powerful dichotomy there. And no, I had not heard of that Dutch scholar before. So thank you for that. Brittany has a question.
Hi, I've got a historical question. The relationship that you describe with the medieval kings to the various institutions in society, that's clearly very different from what it later became. When did that change, and what caused it to change?
Yeah, I mean, later on, let's say in the starting with the later Middle Ages and then proceeding into the modern world, it does start to change, and it changes for a number of reasons. One is intellectual. We start to see gaining ground a number of the works of a number of theorists like oh gosh, who is the one? Oh, and I teach this in Western Civ all the time, but who taught I'm gonna look it up. Defensor Pacis. I just need to see, and I'm gonna feel so bad that I couldn't remember his name. Marsilius of Padua, of course, right? Everybody knows Marsilius of Padua. But Marsilius of Padua began to theorize about the role of the state and the role of the church, and very much in line with what a modern ear wants to hear on this. Marsilius, who wrote this in 1324, is saying that the church really has no secular authority at all. Now, the church had gone through, remember, at its height, it was claiming that it had the power to depose the emperor if it wanted to. It could depose any secular ruler, and that it could stand in judgment of secular rulers. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, any political authority tends to want to expand its power. I mean, that's, we don't have, that's not debatable. Like that's the way it is. And so if that is something you're seeking to do, one thing you would want to do is to minimize or competing power centers. And so Marsilius of Padua is encouraging monarchs to stand up to, he's basically suggesting the church is a paper tiger, and monarchs have got to just start standing up and saying, within my realm, I'm the superior voice, and there is nobody over me. Now, again, to a modern ear, we think, good for you. That's right. The church should stop butting in. But what in practice that means is that one of the limiting institutions gets pushed down a notch. So that, and incidentally, we start to see already I guess even in the 13th century, we already start to see, like, for example, in France with Philip the Fair, we see the state, such as it is, really beginning to push back on the church. I mean, in fact, at one point, there was so much hostility toward Pope Boniface VIII that after he died, they dug up his corpse and put it on trial, which is obviously meant to be, a disgrace, a humiliation for the church. So that's one thing. Then also the other thing, certainly, like, for example, we get to Hobbes. Why is Hobbes so keen on having an authoritarian central power? Not totalitarian, Hobbes's authority is not totalitarian. He's not going to tell you what you should think or what food you should eat or anything, how you should live, but it's authoritarian, which would be like a Saddam Hussein. If you stay out of politics, he's going to leave you alone. Just understand what your place is. So that was kind of the way Hobbes looked at it. Why does he look at it? Because he thinks that when you look at when you have a political model where you have a bunch of little places, that means civil war, or that means war, that means conflict. What you need is one authority over a large area that can keep them all subdued to the point where we limit war. And of course, he's writing after the English Civil War, which he views as the worst possible outcome. And he thinks that one strong sovereign voice will be the thing that makes people safe. And so in a way, it's like today, you've seen all the things people are willing to do because they're being told that it'll make them safe. Well, I'll make you safe because I'm going to be the irresistible person who is going to impose peace on everybody. And don't worry about this. I'm here only for your own good and to keep you safe. Well, that's the direction that states want to go in. And that's what they're being told by the political hangers-on and the philosophers. And that's partly where they go.
Did it have anything to do with money?
Well, you figure presumably it does. The centralization of law in what then would just have been called England did in part come about because what had been a very decentralized system is transformed in a more centralized way because the kings want the revenue that comes from cases being heard in particular courts in their own. And so, again, if you can centralize that, if you can imagine in an Althusian model, just like in the 50 states, there are different laws in the 50 states. But I can promise everybody that we'll have a nice, uniform, easy to understand way of doing this. And I have the added benefit of the revenues coming through into my courts also strengthen the central authority. In terms of the inflation of the money, it's true you can clip the coins and melt them down and put base metals in them, but we actually have some numbers that indicate to us what at least the basics of what the purchasing power was probably like over the past 1,000 years in the history of England. And for at least the first 500 to 600 years, from about 1,000 to 1,600, it's about the same. There's very, very little movement. Most of the debasement of the money has come about, if not within our lifetimes, then within the lifetimes of our grandparents who came before us. Overwhelmingly, almost all of it came then.
Thanks.
Murray?
Oh, Murray, you're muted.
Mhm.
Tom, have you discussed culture at all as a force for decentralization?
Well, that really is today what we're facing. I mean, there were cultural differences between North and South at the time of the Civil War, but one of the driving forces was different economies and all the things that followed from that. I think that's less the issue now, and it is much more a cultural issue. I mean, we see the cultural differences, being acted out all the time in HR departments and corporate boardrooms and so on and so forth, and the different ways different people deal with COVID and so on and so forth. I mean, the differences are quite stark, and these are not matters where one side is inclined to say of the other, well, they have good intentions, but they just see the world differently from how I do, or we're beginning from different first principles, so no surprise we wind up with different conclusions, but you live your way and I will live ours. I'll live my way. That's not the way they think about it. It's like a fight to the death is the way they look at it. The two sides of this cultural divide. And for economic determinists, it's I think it would be hard for them to explain the conflict going on in the U.S. right now, because I don't think it's driven primarily by economics. I mean, no doubt many people have economic grievances, but in terms of the forces that are driving the country apart, it's not that one part is agricultural and the other one is industrial, or it's not that one has this kind of industry and the other one has that. It really is a it really is a matter of one side really loathes and despises what the other one stands for, and it just seems very, very hard to imagine how we could get from this to some kind of reconciliation. I remember Joe Biden saying something like he was going to bring Americans together. Now, we all knew that was just, every politician says that. But I was genuinely curious, what does he think that means? Like, what would that involve? Mm-hmm. How would you bring together, when you just read the headlines at the divisions in the country and how vicious they are? What could a bunch of political slogans do to overcome that? So now it is culture that's driving it.
Scott?
There, I got the thing unmuted, unlike previous times. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for your presentation. And I've enjoyed following you over the years. Our NHF, National Health Federation, financial advisor is Harry Schultz. I don't know if you know his name or not. And he's like 3 years younger than God, but he's a big proponent of what you were just saying, and that is devolution or separation or a national divorce or whatever. But that's not the real reason I raised my hand. I just sort of threw that in as a part of a hi, hello. I was wondering if you're familiar with this book, Who Rules America? And I don't know if you can see it there, by John McConaughey.
Oh,
Who Rules America?
No, but I'd like to see it.
Yeah, it's from 1934. It was written in 1934. I don't know if that can be. Oh, that's the quote, sorry. 1934. And it's an interesting book about the early days of America. And even I, who trained as a historian and interested in this sort of thing, maybe not to the extent that you are in terms of informed, but certainly close on the heels of. And he really talks about how America was controlled by invisible government from the very beginning. And he goes through the examples, and he's very anti-Hamiltonian. Let's see, this is actually printed in New Delhi. So just to give you, maybe I can give you the contact information, or I can put it in it's a reprint from New Delhi. And it's a very interesting book. I haven't finished reading it yet, but he really shows what an absolute demon Alexander Hamilton was. And actually how Thomas Jefferson was very good on idealism, but when it came to the practicality of politics, he completely folded to the vested interests, and was not a good defender of liberty, and really talks up Aaron Burr greatly. Aaron Burr is kind of the hidden hero of this book, at least in the early part, and it covers from the revolution, post-revolution, to 1837 or so. And it talks about the national banks, which is right down your alley, and all of that. So I wasn't sure if you were aware of this book, and if you weren't, I wanted to make you aware of it because it might give you a lot of interesting information. One thing that isn't good about this book is that he's a little bit of a proponent of the Federal Reserve. After he trashes the First National Bank of the United States, the Second National Bank of the United States, then there's a little kind of side comment in here about how, of course, the Federal Reserve, 21 years old at this time in 1934, had helped with the national economy or something. So, you know, there are a few flaws and hiccups and road bumps in it, but it is an interesting book. Anyway, thank you so much for all you do. And I really appreciate your work.
Thank you very much. I'll make note of that book. Thank you.
Tom, continuing on that, you have, I think, a new book coming out, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Economics or something.
Oh, no, that's Tom DiLorenzo. That's already out.
Oh, Tom, okay. I misread the social media post. Sticking to money, though, to what extent is the Althusian approach, the national compact theory, beneficial in terms of the banksters? Kind of, you know, getting back to your Meltdown book and some questions today. How important is decentralization to protect us from some of the international moneyed interests behind some of the Black Rocks and the pharma companies all scheming around the fear to aggrandize their power, et cetera? You know, do you want to comment more about the money angle of this?
A little bit. I mean, I haven't looked at the details of it, but I have seen headlines about what DeSantis wants to do against this whole ESG movement, which, matter of fact, I have an episode coming out of that just today, as soon as I finish here. But because right now there's this craze within American, like within the financial sector of your ESG score, you know, in terms of how well you're complying with the demands of the narrative about whatever it is, climate change or diversity within the company or whatever, all these different considerations. And I know that DeSantis has said, well, at least when it comes to where we put our money, we're going to look exclusively at the question of excellence and, you know, who is pursuing excellence the most, and that's where we'll put our money. So he's actually serving to bring, I bet you a lot of people who kind of like him politically were not even aware of, they don't even know what ESG is. But the fact that we have one governor out of the 50 who, you know, even if he's never elected president, he nevertheless was able to bring this major problem that people who are in control of massive amounts of capital are now enthralled to the obsessions of the regime. And he's able to point this out and say, well, in Florida, we're not going to act like this. You know, that's a benefit of that. I mean, what COVID showed us was that there is still some robustness left to American federalism after all. We really did have some governors who were able to say no to various things. And I think also there have to be some Republican governors looking at DeSantis, realizing how popular he's getting within the party, at least within the grassroots of the party. And if he does something, you got to figure some of them are thinking to themselves, maybe I need to do this in my state. And so even if it starts with just DeSantis, it can spread elsewhere. So that's my initial thought is this ESG thing is a major problem. And, you know, and even though DeSantis isn't president, he's still able to bring it to everybody's attention and try to block it to the extent that he can as a governor.
Just as a follow-up, if we did get a respectful, compact-based decentralization structure to better preserve liberty, to protect us from all these mass formation, indoctrinated psychos that would very easily listen to the powers that be to deprive us of our liberties, whatever, hurt our livelihoods, what kind of money system would result? Will we return to the American banking system of the 1850s? I mean, from your Meltdown book, I'm sure you kind of envisioned what would a free market in money and credit look like. We're very curious how that would look like, because I think that could be a good vision for folks to look at. You're not just losing big Federal Reserve money to fuel malinvestment. You're gaining a more rational, sustainable financial system. Have you thought about that?
I have, but if you want like the really hardcore, this is what the world would look like without the Fed. Like this was what the world would look like specifically with a separation of money and state. That would take too long for me to go through. So what I do have though is a link to what I consider to be the best explanation of this. So the link I would direct you to is tomwoods.com/money. And when you, this is actually a page I put up 10 years ago because I was giving a speech and I wanted to get into this material, but there was just no way I could. So I said to everybody, I created a page with some links on it that you should look at. And so on that page, one of the links is to, I cannot believe this was delivered as congressional testimony, and that will be permanently in the congressional record for as long as this earth exists. But my friend, who's the chairman of the economics department at Grove City College, Jeff Herbener, gave a testimony about exactly what separation of money and state would look like. And it's the most hardcore libertarian thing I think that's ever been uttered, honestly, within the pages of the congressional record. So if you click, I just hope that it's still, do I still have that? Does that link still work? Yes, it does. Okay. So it's, you know, it might be a little technical, but you'll get the gist of it. So check that. Basically what he's saying, I'll give you the one sentence summary. He's saying that although there are ways in which money is different from other goods, in the sense that like we desire money not in and of itself, but we desire money for the things money can bring us. So that does make it different from other goods. It still shares in common basically all the other characteristics of a good in terms of supply and demand, and you need to apply factors of production to produce it and all that. And he's saying that we can apply exactly the same analysis to the production of money that we can apply to the production of men's dress shoes. So it's very, very worth reading. So tomwoods.com/money.
And finally, and other folks can blurt out their questions. In parting, why don't you give us a quick elevator, few seconds on your ventures, your Ron Paul curriculum, that new thing I saw where folks can work with you on their ventures, libertarian ventures. Those are two things that are really interesting. And then kind of how to reach you through your podcast. I think those are your three consistent things going on.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And it seems to me, by the way, that while we've been talking, nationaldivorce.com finally kicked in. So it's now available at nationaldivorce.com, the ebook. So hooray. All right, let's see. The first one you mentioned is the Ron Paul curriculum, which has been around for about 9 years or so. And it's a K through 12 homeschool curriculum that is video based and after the 4th grade is self-taught basically. And I helped to create several of the courses for that. And given it's a lot of videos, I mean, a typical school year is 36 weeks, and we would do one video per weekday. So that's 180 videos per course. And I did 2.5 courses. That's an astonishing amount of work. That took years. But I think it's among the best material I've ever produced. And of course, it serves a good purpose. So the Ron Paul curriculum is not just about making sure that our way of looking at the world is not ignored. It is that, but in addition to the standard subjects that you would expect, we also cover the kinds of things that most schools will not cover. So teaching teenagers how to manage their money, or how to be effective communicators in writing and in speaking, which most people are terrified of, or how to start a home business, things like that I think will give people an advantage. So the website for that, ronpaulhomeschool.com. That's actually my site. That if you click on it, it takes you there. But if you go through my site, I throw in a bunch of bonuses that you can't get anywhere else. So ronpaulhomeschool.com is the first one. Second one is my quote unquote school of life. I came to the conclusion that the problems that people who agree with us these days are not generally that they don't have enough historical knowledge or they don't know enough philosophy. It's they're trying to make their way in an extremely hostile world. And that means figuring out how to get their kids educated, figuring out where to live and how to get there without breaking the bank, what to do with the money that is losing value right before their eyes. Practical questions like this. Practical questions. I gave a presentation on how to speak effectively, how to give a good speech, which that will have an immediate practical effect on you at work and in many other contexts. So we do only practical stuff, no theory, all practical. So the website for that is tomschooloflife.com. And then the third thing, of course, is the Tom Woods Show, which is at approaching 2,200 episodes. And you can find all that at tomwoods.com.
Very good. Anyone, another last minute question? Tom, you're an icon. You produce so much valuable content and projects for the movement. And I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you. And it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.